mentioned the problems with corporate innovation, but let's just kind of highlight them. So the way corporations have evolved is that they've evolved into what we call the operational corporation, and that's because of several reasons. But ultimately, it's about um, being operationally efficient. And so the last 20, 30 years, there's been many things. First, we had IT, information technology, which allowed us to make spreadsheets. It allowed us to get rid of a lot of staff. And when we were all done with that, it allowed us to, with IT now connecting us around the globe, it allowed us to outsource to anywhere in the world that either has real low costs or willing to pay to get our stuff there, right? So all these things are largely operational. They decrease costs. And increase margin. What they do is they allow profit to go up, but fundamental not necessary, so it goes down. And so this has created the current operational corporation, very, very efficient, continues to get more efficient, but in a way has alleviated the pressure to get what's called top line growth. So this is all the bottom line. You've heard people talk about the bottom line. It's because you take out, you remove costs in the bottom, and then your profit becomes higher. The top is revenue. So you might hear something called top line growth. That's the missing thing, actually, and that is related to innovation. So we have a huge shift that needs to occur, and it will occur because nothing like this can go on forever. It's amazing that it's happened over 20, 30 years, but it's partly because huge advancements in IT. Not everything, but it's huge. So the future will depend on that top line innovation growth. And what that means is that we'll now evolve into what we're calling the operational corporation. Oh, sorry, can't make that mistake. The innovation corporation. So, these are our definitions, but it's incredible about the shift. And I would argue that corporation is where we have to go in order to get the top line growth. What that means is the executive staff goes from operational guys. If you look today, typically the staff is all operational because all the top things I just talked about, all of the other bullet points up here that I was just talking about, they let operational people rise because they've created a lot of profit for the company by looking at costs and everything else. So if you're going to reverse this, obviously the executive team needs to become investment oriented. I don't mean investment as in financial people. They're just as removed as operational guys from fundamental innovation. However, the executive staff needs to be investment oriented in terms of understanding medium and long-term innovation. You start to get a picture, like I said, this hybrid organization where the cash cow creates capital, where and that's lower capital costs, because in the future capital costs will be greater. Right now they're at historic lows. Again, this is being recorded in 2013. We have, uh, obviously a huge problem in that these capital costs are artificially low right now, but when they go up, these operational parts of the company will have to generate cash at lower capital costs in the outside market, and then they'll have to be invested internally. This creates a new structure, and it allows the iterative innovation process to proceed in mid to later stage process innovation. Now, whether they actually go to fundamental innovation again or not depends on, I think, a lot whether they control their end markets or not. But what it will mean is they'll partner with universities and other organizations for trying to get at the earlier stages of innovation, try to influence, like I was talking about. They will see that to influence these other organizations like universities to tend to think in a direction for their utility would be a good thing. And so they'll spend resources to do so, and it'll probably be cheaper than having large corporate labs like in the past. One of the important things that I want to get across here is that ignoring market size is going to be a tough thing, because operational guys are thinking naturally, I have X amount in my current product, I've got this revenue, whatever it is, $10 billion, and it's going to go to 12 billion. And if I decrease my cost by X, then I make, 4 billion, or, whatever it is. But so what happens is, in that environment, when you think about investing, you unfortunately always put up on the board, the CEO says, well, I'm going to get 4 billion out of my 10 billion just by doing those things I know how to do. And there's a tendency then to say, wow, okay, we're going to invest quickly in this, and we're going to make $2 billion in X amount of time. And I think, as you can see, what we've been talking about is the innovation process doesn't allow you to tell exactly how it's going to go. And so making projections for such things is pretty difficult. So I was speaking to some corporations that were visiting MIT, and this is the one bullet that made them very nervous, because in front of the CEO you have to say, well, I'm going to invest because this market's going to be X in size. And I think what this, as you can tell from our innovation process, it's very difficult to tell total market size, because you can't tell exactly how it's going to proceed. You certainly can go for large market sizes, but those should not be the only innovation directions you're going in, because some of the other ones can end up being bigger. So the argument here for somebody trying to do this in a corporation is that you're actually trying to create an innovation culture, because regardless of, you're going to get the $2 billion a year market growth 10 years from now by having this type of organization we talked about up here, and that will have influence on the culture itself, and HR will get better at identifying innovators, for example, and there's all this feedback loop. So the argument for not simply saying, well, it's not a $4 billion market today, right? As we know, opening up market uncertainty means I got to think about applications for tomorrow that I don't even know how big they're going to be, but I hope they're big, right? You basically sell this argument because it's true that you're not going to create an innovation culture, and you're not going to have future high growth without it. And that is a sort of systematic view versus just a financial one. That brings us to the final slide of this presentation, the nation state. And we'll build on this for the next set of lectures, lecture 15, which goes over the American innovation system. But now that we're here, let's quickly talk about, the government should invest long-term in sectors in which it participates, or in sectors that are being established within the country through other mechanisms. So what I mean here is that the reason that a country can invest long term. You know, Vannevar Bush's big thing was that, hey, if we invest beyond the horizon of normal company time horizon, we'll help them. And it makes sense if you're in many areas in the economy. So, for example, for the United States, you know, this process, which in the early days, if you look at it from a time point of view, investing 20 years out or whatever it is incredibly risky for a company. And the reason it's risky for a company is to look at the uncertainty we purposely introduce. Remember, we talked about how you have to have uncertainty introduced. And think about a company over here. You know, what market will I be in 20 years from? You know, will I even exist? And then, you know, you say, oh, what business model will I be using? All these things are huge, huge uncertainties. And what else would be invented along the way? So these already mean that for a company, you can do a simple model which shows that, you know, the chance of me being in my exact market, which is small, remember, like whatever that is at the time, and me knowing exactly what technology to invest in and what business model is extremely difficult. That's why we have this model, right? So if a company can't do it with a high return, why would a nation state? And the answer is that because as long as this process happens, and it's happening in all areas, the country, like especially a country the size of the United States, economic size, meaning that it participates in pretty much every sector of the economy, of the global economy, if it initially had started off and wanted an investment, let's say, and it thought that this particular technology was going to influence a particular application, and that's how it justifies doing it. And this technology changes and actually influences another technology, and at the end of the day, it's this one, and not this one and that one. But the fact that I'm exploring all of these allows us to converge on those two pieces. Then the government still wins because it's an innovation that arrives in its economy. So maybe to clear this and make it a little bit more clear, if let's suppose that I'm in a government organization, I invest in a semiconductor technology, and it ends up creating some nano manufacturing thing, and it never really quite goes, you know, doesn't converge like we thought into that market segment. But it turns out that someone picks up on that, runs a different path in innovation, and converges. Instead of in semiconductor, the application ends up converging in medical technology, because you make, you know, some nano thing that solves a cancer or whatever. So, or can diagnose cancer, you know, whatever. So the point is that to a company, if I were a semiconductor company and I invested that long, this would be a loss because it doesn't affect semiconductors. If I'm a country and I am participating in both the semiconductor and market segment, medical technology segments, then I win, because regardless of where it ends up, I collect tax revenue and I can keep this whole thing going. So that's what we mean by, you know, being involved in sectors. And what it does say, by the way, is that if you want to have a knowledge-based economy, you should try to be involved in many sectors of the global economy. This also explains why, if you have one segment dominating because you have a natural resource, the thing called Dutch disease, like if you have oil, it's really difficult because it tends to suck everybody into that one sector, and then your ability to invest long term is really tough, because if it doesn't happen to hit oil, those investments generally help things outside the country, and unless you have some mechanism for getting it back, it's very difficult. So it explains a lot, actually, about various things, again, just by focusing on innovation. So a high quality innovation pipeline requires a porous university structure. I think you can see we've talked about that quite a bit. Incentives for corporations to perform longer-term investment, and it has to be much better than whatever R&D tax credit, for example, the United States has, because clearly it's not working. People use it for other things, and they're not really investing long-term. So I wouldn't call it just long-term, fundamental innovation, towards fundamental innovation. Maybe not going all the way, but at least investing. And the question is, how would you measure all this and make sure they're really doing it? Incentives. See, use of incentives makes sense, right? Because this bottom-up type of thing we've been talking about, where it's the human process of innovating that causes, then you want those individuals to do it and so you want the organizations above them to take advantage of that to also enhance the process. And the way you can do that at the next level up at the nation state is to have incentives in order to have individuals and importantly companies maximize innovation productivity. By having people exchange between university, government, corporation, you also increase the MIT iterative loop, because people get understanding, the government gets an understanding of what's going on. They get proper signaling so they know how to change the incentives, or in the case of research investment, align them to some particular areas. Corporations should be doing most of the innovation investment if it was possible to construct a tax code to do it, because their tail would overlap with universities, and by having people exchange between them, you'd have the best of both worlds by having MIT knowledge distributed over the world. The other thing I mentioned is that remember the MIT, the market implementation technology, today is not going to really be sufficient to just look at within a nation state. And so we need to participate and encourage exchange between countries as well. And good examples of those are happening at MIT right now. Maybe not as involved as I've been talking about here, but nation states have realized that somehow doing this work together is valuable, and especially for countries that want to jumpstart their innovation system, that they have to go out there and partner, that getting it to happen within a country, just like I was saying, even in the US today, thinking that our own innovation system completely enclosed on itself gives us all the market implementation and technology knowledge we need is not true. And so for everyone's purposes, these global alliances and starting things, so like at MIT, we have the Singapore MIT Alliance that was started in the late 90s. That's been great for starting to understand all of this, both on the US and on the Singapore side. And they're a lot more in similar position in the sense that when the US was able to drive its whole economy, kind of an internal innovation system, it didn't have the difficulty of having to go out and understand global markets, market applications, implementation, where Singapore always did, because it's so small. Most of its major markets were outside of it. And ironically, America is closer to that situation now, where we have to learn how to get market application, implementation knowledge from outside as well as inside in order to innovate and find the greatest global fundamental innovations. And there's many more partnerships that have formed with various countries, and I think that's a very important thing to do. So I'll end this lecture, since we're now going to kind of go up into Vannevar Bush's, large philosophy that influenced America post-World War II. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the American innovation system. And Vannevar Bush had this foremost the title of a paper he wrote, but also, the phrase, the endless frontier, meaning that despite the fact that we have innovation paradigms where things slow down, they will always start up again. Mankind will never stop inventing. They will never stop innovating. And just to show you that it's timeless, but we've had to change our words because of specialization I was talking about before. The endless frontier has a definition in it from Vannevar Bush as early as 1942, where he said the engineer was not primarily a physicist or a businessman or an inventor, but someone who would acquire some of the skills and knowledge of each of these and be capable of successfully developing and applying new devices on a grand scale. There you have it, what we were talking about in this lecture, which was how an innovator has to have market implementation and technology ideas. Really goes back to Vannevar Bush's definition of the engineer. So it is interesting to think about the engineer today because of our last 50 years of specialization has made a connotation of the word engineer be that it's specialized in technology. When actually, if you go back to the wave that started sort of nation-state investing in R&D, you can see that it was the engineer that was considered what we're calling an innovator today. So I think that's kind of interesting because it tells us exactly where we are and motivates our next topic, which is let's look at the American innovation system now that we understand all this. And that will help tell us where we are in a macro system. So we'll come back to that in lecture 15.